I did not get on the sourdough bandwagon during COVID because, well, in March of 2020, our kids were 3.5 and 6. And of course, both my husband and I have full time jobs. Unlike many folks during lockdown, we were not bored. But I had some starter hanging out in my fridge. My sister in law had given it to us as a housewarming present when we moved here in 2016. Throughout COVID, it had sat, neglected, in the back of the fridge, looking pretty sad and gross, if I'm honest. The way sourdough starter works is that if you want to use it for bread, you need to feed it flour to keep it healthy. Every day if it's out on your counter, or every week or so if it's in your fridge. And every time you feed it, you save about 15 grams of starter and throw away the rest. Now, all I'd ever done with it was to make crumpets out of the throwaway starter. They're delicious, by the way. Check the link in the description. But it had been a while since I'd had the desire to do even that. I mean, I have no idea how long it had been since I'd thought about my sad little starter. Embarrassingly long. Like months. After witnessing a colleague bake fresh sourdough bread at our fall retreat last year, I'd gotten inspired to try to resurrect my starter. And tiny little bubbles had started to form, letting me know that my starter was, in fact, still alive. But I wasn't getting any of the literally over-the-top rising action that those Instagram-ready cooking blogs would have me expect. Pastor Brad at Lumen Austin is an incredible sourdough bread baker. He teaches his students to bake sourdough. He bakes it for communion every week. When I saw him in February for an anti-racism retreat in New Orleans, I went to him for a little sourdough intervention and problem solving. He told me not to give up on it and definitely not to throw it away. Just keep feeding it. Just keep trusting that eventually it would come back and be okay. He assured me that my efforts would ultimately pay off and that I'd be way better off with my neglected little sourdough starter than I would be if I'd pitched it and started over. Yeast is a funny thing because, of course, you can get the store-bought stuff that should rise every single time the same way. That's predictable and mass-produced. You can leave those little granules in the fridge for months on end, and as long as the expiration date hasn't passed a long time ago, you're probably good to go. And that's totally great, especially for those of us who don't have time or who don't remember to pay attention to the little bubbly beings hanging out in a neglected jar in the back of the fridge. But wild yeast gives a different and richer flavor. It's definitely unpredictable and it requires experience and skill to bake with it. And yet, who would trade a really good sourdough for a plain old store-bought white sandwich bread? It's the unpredictability, the lack of control that gives a richness to the flavor that can't be gotten in a factory, that allows the taster to exclaim, wow, this bread is amazing. And because this kind of bread takes time and effort, no one, at least no one I know, makes a whole loaf just for themselves. It's too special. It's meant to be shared. Of course, in Jesus' time, there was no store-bought yeast. There were no factories to produce little predictable granules that could be awakened with a little sugar and water. So the only yeast that they had needed to be cared for and fed, and it produced results that were probably always tasty, but also probably often unpredictable, especially for the unskilled. In order for my yeast to raise a loaf of bread, it needs a little assist from the store-bought stuff. But yeast that can raise 3 measures of flour, like in Jesus' parable, in modern terms, that's about a bushel of flour. In context, it takes about 3 cups of flour to bake 1 loaf of bread. Jesus is talking about abundance here, enough for about 50 modern loaves of bread. And yet, for the experienced baker, this yeast would be unassuming, because an experienced baker would know how to prepare the yeast for such a big job. It's normal, it's everyday, it's the kind of thing you don't even think about. The kingdom of heaven is like that. So normal, so everyday, so essential to our lives and who we are. It's the air we breathe, the water we're swimming in. Now, Jesus has thrown a lot of metaphors at us today, and his disciples are quick to assure him that they understand everything he's just told them. I want to note that some commentary writers think that this moment is an actual honest-to-goodness joke. Jesus knows his disciples don't often pick up what he's putting down, and so he says, maybe with a wink, You got that? And they say, yeah, sure, right. So if you're confused by these different rapid fire images of the kingdom of heaven, you are in good company. In a few short verses, we hear that the kingdom of heaven is so small and ordinary that you wouldn't notice it unless you knew to look, but it grows into something so expansive that it can provide food and shelter for many. The kingdom of heaven is like something priceless and irreplaceable that's worth sacrificing everything for. And while we still experience plenty of evil in our lives here on this earth, in the kingdom of heaven, which by the way is also here on this earth, that evil will ultimately be cast out. Matthew's language of fire and weeping and gnashing of teeth sounds pretty dramatic to our ears, but to first century Jews living under Roman oppression, this vision of God's justice finally coming to even the most powerful people on this earth was full of resounding hope. After a couple of months sitting in the back of my fridge, I took my sourdough starter out again, put it in a clean jar, and gave it new water and flour. After just a few minutes, I could see little bubbles starting to form, indicating that my starter is definitely not done with me yet. I won't pretend that I'm the most attentive sourdough mom, or that I can make the best sourdough bread yet. But somehow that yeast continues even when it's been sitting there, seemingly dormant for a while. But just because I'm not paying attention doesn't mean it's dormant. Like the Spirit who prays with sighs too deep for words when our words fail us, God's kingdom is present even when we forget it. God's kingdom is present, breaking into our lives even when we're not noticing. God's kingdom isn't so delicate that it depends on our attentive care. God's kingdom is abundant. It's not just about us as individuals, it's for the whole world. When we remember to look for it, when we remember the promise that God's kingdom holds in our lives and our world, when we look to find the ways that God's kingdom is breaking into our lives, even when we're sure nothing can make anything better, our lives and our communities are all made richer together. Amen.